The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valeria Palace as Prince Alexander walked quietly through the eastern corridor. At 19, he had grown tired of the constant ceremonies and formal events that filled his days. Today, like many others, he sought solace in the quieter parts of the palace, where he could think without interruption. As he rounded the corner near the servants' quarters, he noticed something that made him pause. Guard Captain Marcus Webb stood at his post by the service entrance, but something was different. The man who had protected the royal family for nearly 30 years seemed smaller somehow, his usually straight shoulders slightly hunched. Alexander had known Marcus since childhood. The guard had been the one to teach him how to hold a sword properly when he was 8 years old. Marcus had also been there during Alexander's rebellious teenage years, quietly steering him away from trouble without ever reporting his minor misdeeds to the king and queen. But now, watching Marcus struggle to maintain his rigid posture, Alexander noticed details he had somehow missed before. The guard's uniform, while clean and pressed, showed signs of wear that spoke of many years of faithful service. His boots, though polished to a shine, had been resoled multiple times. Most concerning of all was the way Marcus occasionally pressed his hand against his lower back when he thought no one was looking. Alexander remembered overhearing a conversation between his parents a few weeks earlier. They had been discussing the palace staff and their concerns about some of the older employees. His mother had mentioned Marcus specifically, worrying about his health and whether he should consider retirement. His father had dismissed the concern, saying that Marcus had never complained and seemed as dedicated as ever. The prince realized he had been standing there for several minutes, lost in thought. Marcus had noticed him and immediately straightened to attention, offering a respectful bow. "Good morning, Your Highness," the guard said, his voice as steady and professional as always. "Good morning, Marcus," Alexander replied, studying the man's face. Up close, he could see the lines around Marcus's eyes, the silver threading through his hair and the slight tremor in his hands that he tried to hide. "How are you feeling today?" The question seemed to surprise Marcus. In all their years of interaction, Alexander had never asked about his personal well-being. "Very well, thank you, Your Highness. Ready to serve as always." Alexander nodded but didn't move on as he usually would. Instead, he found himself genuinely curious about this man who had been such a constant presence in his life. "Marcus, may I ask you something? How long have you been with our family?" 29 years this spring, Your Highness," Marcus replied with obvious pride. "I started when I was 22, fresh from military service. Your grandfather, King Edmund, hired me personally." 29 years, Alexander repeated thoughtfully. "You've seen a lot of changes in that time." Marcus's expression softened slightly. "Indeed, Your Highness. I've had the honor of watching you grow from a small boy into the fine young man you are today. It has been the greatest privilege of my life to serve your family." The sincerity in Marcus's voice touched something deep in Alexander's heart. Here was a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting people who rarely acknowledged his sacrifice. The prince began to see his family's treatment of their staff in a new light. "Marcus, do you have family of your own?" Alexander asked, genuinely interested in learning more about the man behind the uniform. For a moment, Marcus hesitated, as if unsure whether such personal conversation was appropriate. Then he seemed to decide that answering the prince's question was part of his duty. "I have a daughter, Your Highness, Sarah. She's 25 now, married with 2 children of her own. My grandchildren." Alexander could hear the love and pride in Marcus's voice when he spoke of his family. "Do you see them often?" "Not as often as I would like," Marcus admitted quietly. "My duties here require long hours and they live quite far from the palace. But Sarah understands the importance of my work here. She's proud of what I do." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Lady Catherine, the Queen's personal assistant, appeared around the corner with a look of mild urgency on her face. "Your Highness, your mother is looking for you. You have a fitting for tomorrow's state dinner." Alexander sighed inwardly. Another formal event. Another opportunity to stand around making polite conversation with diplomats and nobles who saw him only as a symbol rather than a person. "Thank you, Lady Catherine. I'll be there shortly." As the assistant hurried away, Alexander turned back to Marcus. The guard had resumed his formal posture, the brief moment of personal connection seemingly forgotten. But Alexander couldn't forget what he had learned. Here was a man who had given everything to serve his family, who had sacrificed time with his own loved ones for their safety and comfort. "Marcus," Alexander said quietly, "thank you for everything you do for us. I know it doesn't get said often enough, but your service means more than you know." The surprise on Marcus's face was unmistakable. In nearly 3 decades of service, it was perhaps the first time a member of the royal family had personally thanked him for his dedication. "Your Highness, it is my honor," he managed to say, his voice slightly thick with emotion. As Alexander walked away toward his mother's chambers, his mind was already working. The conversation with Marcus had opened his eyes to something he had never really considered before. The palace was full of people like Marcus, people who had devoted their lives to serving his family, often at great personal cost. They deserved better than polite indifference. The prince spent the rest of the morning going through the motions of his royal duties, but his thoughts kept returning to Marcus and the quiet dignity with which the man bore his burdens. By the time the fitting was over and he had endured another lecture from his etiquette tutor, Alexander had made a decision. He was going to do something about it, something that would honor not just Marcus but all the dedicated people who made the palace run smoothly. But it would have to be done carefully, in a way that wouldn't embarrass anyone or create problems for the staff. Alexander knew that grand gestures often had unintended consequences. What was needed was something more subtle, more personal, something that would truly make a difference in the lives of people who had given so much of themselves. Over the following days, Alexander found himself paying closer attention to the palace staff in ways he never had before. What he discovered troubled him deeply. The servants and guards who had been fixtures in his life for years were struggling with problems he had never bothered to notice. Mrs. Eleanor, the head housekeeper who had been with the family for 15 years, walked with a pronounced limp that worsened during the long winter months. She never complained, but Alexander noticed how she gripped the banister tightly when climbing stairs. James, one of the kitchen staff, had developed a persistent cough that echoed through the corridors, yet he continued working 16-hour days preparing meals for the royal family and their frequent guests. But it was Marcus who remained most on Alexander's mind. The prince began timing his walks to coincide with the guard's shifts, engaging him in brief conversations that gradually revealed more about the man's life. He learned that Marcus lived in a small apartment in the village below the palace, a modest place that he had called home for nearly 3 decades. He discovered that Marcus sent most of his salary to help support his daughter's family, particularly since her husband had been injured in a workplace accident and couldn't work full-time anymore. Most significantly, Alexander learned that Marcus had been hiding the extent of his physical struggles. The old injury from his military service had worsened over the years of standing guard for long hours. His knees ached constantly, and his back pain had become so severe that he sometimes couldn't sleep at night. Yet Marcus had never requested lighter duties or complained about his condition, fearing that any sign of weakness might cost him his position. Alexander also discovered something that made his chest tighten with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Marcus had been eligible for retirement with full benefits for over 5 years, but he continued working because he genuinely believed the royal family needed him. He took his oath of protection seriously, viewing his role not just as a job but as a sacred duty. The more Alexander learned, the more he realized how little he truly knew about the people who had shaped his life. These individuals had sacrificed their health, their time with family, and their personal dreams to serve his family with unwavering loyalty. They deserved recognition, respect, and most importantly, they deserved to know that their sacrifices were valued and appreciated. One afternoon, while walking through the palace gardens, Alexander encountered Sarah, a young maid who had recently joined the staff. She was sitting on a bench during her break, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a letter in her hands. Alexander's instinct was to continue walking and leave her to her privacy, as he had been taught was proper protocol. But something about her obvious distress made him stop. "Excuse me," he said gently, approaching the bench. "Are you all right?" Sarah immediately jumped to her feet and curtsied deeply, hastily wiping her tears and trying to compose herself. "Your Highness, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize anyone was here. I should return to my duties immediately." "Please don't apologize," Alexander said, surprising himself with his words. "You're on your break, aren't you? You have every right to be here. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." The kindness in his voice seemed to break down Sarah's professional reserve. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she struggled to maintain her composure. "It's my mother, Your Highness. She's very ill, and the doctors say she needs expensive treatment that we can't afford. I came here hoping to earn enough money to help her, but even working 7 days a week, it's not enough." Alexander felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Here was another example of someone suffering in silence while continuing to serve his family faithfully. "How long have you been working here?" he asked. 3 months, Your Highness. "I'm grateful for the position, truly I am. It's just that time is running out for my mother, and I feel so helpless." The prince studied Sarah's face, seeing the same dedication and quiet strength that he had observed in Marcus and the other longtime staff members. These people didn't ask for special treatment or favors. They simply worked harder than anyone should have to work, hoping that their efforts would eventually provide for their loved ones. "Sarah," Alexander said carefully, "what kind of treatment does your mother need?" She explained her mother's condition, a treatable illness that required medication and procedures that were available but expensive. As Alexander listened, he realized that the cost of her mother's treatment was less than what his family spent on flowers for a single state dinner. That evening, Alexander retreated to his private study and began researching the palace's employment policies and benefit structures. What he found shocked him. While the royal family lived in luxury that bordered on excess, their loyal employees received modest wages with minimal benefits. There was no comprehensive healthcare coverage, no assistance for family emergencies, and no meaningful recognition for years of faithful service. He spent hours reading through employment records, learning about the personal struggles of people he had known for years but never really seen. The night watchman had been supporting his disabled brother for over a decade. One of the gardeners had postponed his own wedding 3 times because he couldn't afford both the ceremony and helping his aging parents. A kitchen assistant had been working double shifts to pay for her son's education, believing that serving the royal family would somehow create opportunities for her child's future. Alexander realized that his family's wealth and privilege had insulated them from understanding the real impact of their employment practices. They weren't intentionally cruel or indifferent, but they had become so removed from the daily struggles of ordinary people that they couldn't see the hardship occurring right under their roof. As he sat in his study, surrounded by files and documents, Alexander began to formulate a plan. It would need to be comprehensive enough to make a real difference, but subtle enough to avoid creating political complications or embarrassing anyone. Most importantly, it would need to be sustainable, something that would continue long after he was gone. The plan that began taking shape in his mind was ambitious, but achievable. It would start with individual acts of recognition and support, then gradually expand into systematic changes that would improve conditions for all palace employees. But first he would focus on Marcus, the man whose quiet dignity had opened his eyes to this hidden world of sacrifice and dedication. Alexander knew that whatever he did for Marcus would need to be handled with the utmost sensitivity. The guard's pride and sense of duty would make him resistant to anything that seemed like charity or pity. The gesture would need to honor Marcus's service while providing him with genuine relief and opportunities for happiness. As the clock struck midnight, Alexander closed the files and made his final decision. Tomorrow he would begin implementing a plan that would change not just Marcus's life, but the entire culture of how the royal family treated those who served them. It would be quiet, respectful, and most importantly, it would come from a place of genuine gratitude and recognition rather than obligation or guilt. The next morning, Alexander began his mission with careful research. Instead of immediately approaching Marcus or any of the staff directly, he decided to gather more information about their situations through discreet observation and conversations with palace administrators who handled employee affairs. His first stop was the palace's Human Resources Office, a small department tucked away in the administrative wing that he had never visited before. Mrs. Patricia Kellerman, the head of personnel, seemed startled when Prince Alexander appeared at her door. In her 20 years managing palace employees, no member of the royal family had ever shown interest in the day-to-day operations of staff management. "Your Highness," she said, rising quickly from her desk and offering a nervous curtsy. "How may I assist you?" Alexander had prepared for this conversation carefully. "Mrs. Kellerman, I'm conducting research for a project about the history of our family's relationship with our staff. I'm particularly interested in learning about employees who have shown exceptional dedication over many years. The explanation seemed to put Mrs. Kellerman at ease. She began sharing stories about the palace's longtime employees with obvious affection and respect. Alexander learned that Marcus wasn't the only staff member who had gone above and beyond in his service. There was Mrs. Eleanor, who had worked through her own health challenges without ever missing a day. There was Thomas, the maintenance supervisor, who had prevented several potentially dangerous situations through his attention to detail and willingness to work overtime without compensation. These people, Mrs. Kellerman said with genuine warmth, they're not just employees, they're the heart of this palace. Some of them have been here longer than I have, and they know these buildings and grounds better than anyone. They take personal pride in maintaining the standards that reflect well on your family. Alexander asked about the challenges these employees faced, and Mrs. Kellerman's expression grew more serious. She explained that while the palace provided stable employment, the wages hadn't increased significantly in recent years, despite rising costs of living. Many employees worked additional jobs to make ends meet, and several had postponed important medical treatments because they couldn't afford both the treatment and the time off work. Marcus Webb, for instance, Mrs. Kellerman said, consulting her files. He's been eligible for retirement benefits for years, but he continues working. I've spoken with him about it several times, suggesting he might want to consider reducing his hours or transitioning to a less physically demanding role. He always says he's fine and that the royal family needs him at full capacity. Alexander felt his resolve strengthen. Marcus's dedication was even more extraordinary than he had realized. The man was literally sacrificing his health and his golden years because he believed his duty to the royal family was more important than his personal well-being. After leaving Mrs. Kellerman's office, Alexander made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of returning to his scheduled activities, he walked to the village below the palace. He had rarely ventured into the community where most of the palace staff lived, and he wanted to understand their world better. The village was charming in a way that the palace's grandeur couldn't match. Small stone houses lined narrow streets, and children played in yards while their parents tended gardens or chatted with neighbors. Alexander kept his identity concealed by wearing simple clothes and avoiding areas where he might be recognized. He found the street where Marcus lived and walked past the guards building. It was a modest apartment complex, well-maintained but clearly housing people of limited means. Alexander imagined Marcus returning here each evening after long hours protecting the royal family, probably too tired to do much more than eat a simple meal and rest his aching joints. As he walked through the village, Alexander encountered other palace employees going about their daily lives. He saw Sarah at the local market, carefully counting coins as she selected the least expensive vegetables. He watched James, the kitchen worker with the persistent cough, stopping frequently to catch his breath, as he carried groceries home to his own family. These observations reinforced Alexander's growing understanding that the people who served his family weren't just doing jobs, they were making daily sacrifices that affected every aspect of their lives. Their dedication came at a personal cost that the royal family had never fully acknowledged or appreciated. That afternoon, Alexander began implementing the first phase of his plan. He arranged a private meeting with the palace's financial advisor, Mr. Richardson, requesting complete discretion about their discussion. Alexander explained that he wanted to establish a fund that could provide assistance to longtime employees facing personal challenges. I'm thinking of it as a recognition program, Alexander explained. Something that honors exceptional service while providing practical support for people who have given so much to our family. Mr. Richardson was intrigued by the proposal and agreed to help structure the fund in a way that would be both effective and sustainable. They discussed various approaches, from one-time grants to ongoing support programs, considering how to implement assistance without creating awkwardness or resentment among staff members. Alexander also requested detailed information about the retirement benefits available to palace employees. He was shocked to learn that while the benefits existed on paper, they were modest at best, designed more to meet legal requirements than to provide genuine security for retired workers. Mr. Richardson, Alexander said thoughtfully, what would it cost to significantly improve the retirement benefits for our current staff, particularly those who have served for many years? The financial advisor ran some quick calculations and presented figures that surprised Alexander. The cost of providing meaningful retirement security for all longtime palace employees was less than the royal family spent on entertainment and travel in a typical year. It was a manageable expense that could transform the lives of dozens of dedicated workers. As their meeting concluded, Alexander felt a sense of urgency about moving forward with his plans. Every day that passed was another day that Marcus and others continued to struggle unnecessarily. But he also knew that rushing into action without careful consideration could create problems or, worse, could hurt the very people he was trying to help. That evening, Alexander made a decision about his next step. He would approach Marcus directly, but not with offers of help or charity. Instead, he would ask for Marcus's guidance and wisdom, framing his request in a way that honored the guard's experience and knowledge. The conversation he planned would need to be perfect. It would set the tone for everything that followed, and Alexander knew that Marcus's response would determine whether his larger plan could succeed. The guard's pride and dignity were paramount, and any approach that seemed patronizing or pitying would be rejected immediately. Alexander spent hours that night preparing for what might be the most important conversation of his young life. He was about to embark on a course of action that would challenge long-standing traditions and potentially change the entire relationship between the royal family and their staff. But for the first time since beginning this journey, he felt completely certain that he was doing the right thing. Marcus had spent nearly 30 years protecting and serving the royal family with unwavering loyalty. Now it was time for that loyalty to be truly recognized and reciprocated. The following morning, Alexander found Marcus at his usual post by the eastern entrance. The guard stood at attention as always, but Alexander had learned to read the subtle signs of his discomfort. The way Marcus shifted his weight slightly, from foot to foot, the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, the careful way he moved when he thought no one was watching. "Good morning, Marcus," Alexander said warmly. "I hope you don't mind, but I was hoping we could have a longer conversation today. I find myself in need of some advice from someone with your experience." Marcus straightened even further, if that were possible. "Of course, Your Highness, I am always at your service." "Actually," Alexander said carefully, "I was wondering if we might speak somewhere more private. Perhaps we could walk through the gardens. I know it's unusual, but what I want to discuss requires discretion." The request clearly surprised Marcus, but his decades of training in following royal requests without question took over. "Certainly, Your Highness. Shall I arrange for another guard to cover my post?" "Please do," Alexander said. "And Marcus, this conversation is between us. I hope I can trust your discretion." As they walked toward the palace gardens, Alexander could sense Marcus's curiosity and slight nervousness. In all their years of interaction, they had never had anything approaching a private, extended conversation. Alexander chose a secluded bench near the rose garden, a spot where they could speak without being overheard or interrupted. "Marcus," Alexander began, settling onto the bench and gesturing for the guard to sit beside him. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about the people who make our family's life possible. I've realized that I've spent my entire life surrounded by dedicated, hard-working individuals, but I've never really taken the time to understand their lives or acknowledge their sacrifices." Marcus remained standing for a moment, clearly uncomfortable, with the idea of sitting casually beside a member of the royal family. Only when Alexander insisted did he reluctantly take a seat, maintaining perfect posture even in this informal setting. "Your Highness," Marcus said carefully, "it has been my honor to serve your family. No acknowledgement is necessary." "But that's exactly what I want to talk about," Alexander continued. "Marcus, you've been with us for nearly 30 years. You've watched me grow up, protected my family through countless events and potential threats, and you've done it all with grace and professionalism that goes far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect." Alexander paused, studying Marcus's face. The guard's expression remained professionally neutral, but Alexander could see surprise and perhaps a hint of emotion in his eyes. "I've learned some things recently that have made me realize how little I truly knew about the people who work for us," Alexander continued. For instance, I learned that you've been eligible for retirement for several years, but you continue working despite health challenges that I should have noticed long ago." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Your Highness, I assure you that my health does not interfere with my duties. I am fully capable of protecting your family." "I'm sure you are," Alexander said gently. "Your dedication has never been in question. But Marcus, what I'm beginning to understand is that dedication shouldn't come at the cost of personal well-being or happiness. You have a daughter and grandchildren who barely get to see you because of your commitment to us." For the first time, Marcus's professional composure cracked slightly. Alexander could see the internal struggle between the guard's ingrained sense of duty and his natural human desires to spend time with his family. "Marcus," Alexander said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If you knew with absolute certainty that your family would be well protected and well served, would you want to spend more time with your daughter and grandchildren?" The question hung in the air between them. Marcus was clearly wrestling with how to answer truthfully without seeming disloyal or ungrateful for his position. "Your Highness," he said slowly, "my duty to your family is the most important thing in my life. It has defined who I am for 3 decades. That's not what I asked," Alexander said kindly but firmly. "I asked about what you would want if you knew your duty was fulfilled and your service was properly honored." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Alexander had ever heard it. "I think about my grandchildren every day, Your Highness. Sarah tells me they ask about their grandfather who works at the palace. They're proud of what I do, but they're growing up without really knowing me. My youngest granddaughter is 5 years old, and I've probably spent less than 20 full days with her in her entire life." The pain in Marcus's voice was unmistakable, and Alexander felt his resolve strengthen even further. Here was a man who had sacrificed not just his health and comfort, but precious relationships with the people he loved most, all in service to the royal family. "Marcus," Alexander said, "what if I told you that there was a way to honor your incredible service while also giving you the opportunity to be the grandfather your grandchildren deserve? What if you could retire with dignity and security, knowing that your years of dedication were properly recognized and rewarded?" Marcus looked up sharply, confusion and hope warring in his expression. "Your Highness, I don't understand." Alexander took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the conversation that would determine whether his plan could move forward. "I want to establish a new tradition in our family, Marcus. A way of recognizing exceptional service that goes beyond a simple thank you or a standard retirement package." He explained his vision of creating a comprehensive program that would honor longtime employees with meaningful recognition and substantial support. Not charity, but earned recognition for extraordinary service. The program would include enhanced retirement benefits, healthcare support, and assistance for family needs, all presented as honors rather than handouts. "But Marcus," Alexander continued, "I need guidance from someone who understands both the palace culture and the needs of our staff. I need someone who can help me design this program in a way that truly honors people, rather than embarrassing them or creating problems." Marcus listened intently as Alexander outlined his ideas. The guard's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that looked like amazement. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "you're serious about this?" "Completely serious," Alexander confirmed. "Marcus, you would be the first recipient of this recognition, but more importantly, I want you to help me create something that will benefit everyone who has served our family with the kind of dedication you've shown." For the first time in their conversation, Marcus smiled. Not the professional smile of a guard acknowledging a royal, but the genuine smile of a man who suddenly saw possibilities he had never dared to imagine. "Your Highness," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, "it would be the greatest honor of my life to help you with such a project." As they sat together in the garden, Alexander realized that this conversation had changed both of their lives forever. Marcus would finally have the opportunity to be the grandfather and family man he had always wanted to be, while also playing a crucial role in creating a legacy that would benefit countless others. And Alexander had taken his first real step toward becoming the kind of leader he wanted to be, one who recognized and valued the people who made leadership possible. Over the following weeks, Alexander and Marcus met regularly in the garden, their conversations evolving from tentative discussions into detailed planning sessions. Marcus proved to be an invaluable advisor, bringing insights that Alexander never could have gained on his own. The guard understood the palace culture intimately and could predict how different staff members would react to various approaches. Mrs. Eleanor would be mortified if she thought anyone saw her as needing help, Marcus explained during one of their meetings. But if you framed it as recognizing her expertise and asking her to train new staff while transitioning to a less physically demanding role, she would see it as an honor rather than charity. Alexander took careful notes as Marcus shared his knowledge about each longtime employee. The guard knew their personal struggles, their family situations, and their individual personalities in ways that revealed just how much he cared about his colleagues. These weren't just co-workers to Marcus. They were friends whose well-being mattered to him deeply. Together, they developed what they called the Palace Family Recognition Program. The name was Marcus's suggestion, emphasizing that longtime employees weren't just workers, but were considered part of an extended family. The program would have several components: enhanced retirement packages for eligible employees, healthcare assistance for active staff and retirees, educational support for employees' children, and emergency assistance funds for unexpected family crises. Most importantly, the program would include meaningful roles for retirees who wanted to stay connected to the palace. Marcus suggested creating advisory positions where former employees could mentor new staff, share their expertise, and maintain their sense of purpose and connection to the royal family. People like Mrs. Eleanor and Thomas have knowledge that can't be replaced, Marcus explained. They know every corner of this palace, every tradition, every way of doing things that makes everything run smoothly. When they retire, all of that knowledge goes with them unless we find ways to preserve it. Alexander was impressed by Marcus's vision. The guard was thinking beyond individual assistance to create something that would benefit the entire palace community for years to come. This wasn't just about helping current employees. It was about building a culture of respect and mutual support that would make the palace a better place for everyone. Their first concrete action was addressing the immediate needs of employees who were struggling with health or family issues. Alexander arranged for Sarah's mother to receive the medical treatment she needed, but he did it through the new Emergency Assistance Fund, rather than personal charity. Sarah was told that her dedication and positive attitude had earned her recognition, and that the assistance was a benefit available to all deserving employees. When Sarah learned about the help, she broke down in tears of gratitude. But what moved Alexander most was her immediate response. She asked if there was any way she could work extra hours, or take on additional responsibilities to earn the assistance. Even when receiving help, her instinct was to give more rather than take more. Alexander also arranged for James, the kitchen worker with the persistent cough, to receive medical evaluation and treatment. Like Sarah, James was told that this was recognition for his years of dedicated service. The treatment revealed that James had a serious but treatable respiratory condition that, if left untreated, could have become life-threatening. Word of these assists began to spread quietly through the palace staff, but rather than creating jealousy or expectations, it seemed to boost morale and loyalty. Employees began to understand that their well-being mattered to the royal family, that their years of service were valued, and that they weren't just expendable workers but respected members of the palace community. Marcus proved to be an excellent bridge between Alexander and the staff. His colleagues trusted him completely, and his enthusiasm for the new program helped convince skeptical employees that these changes were genuine and lasting. When Mrs. Eleanor was initially resistant to accepting a modified work schedule that would be easier on her arthritis, Marcus was able to convince her that her experience was too valuable to lose, and that the royal family needed her wisdom in a mentoring role. The transformation in Marcus himself was remarkable to witness. As he became involved in creating and implementing the program, he seemed to shed years of weariness and pain. He stood straighter, smiled more often, and approached his work with renewed energy. Alexander realized that giving Marcus a meaningful role in improving conditions for his colleagues had given the guard something he had never had before: the sense that his decades of service were creating a lasting, positive legacy. But perhaps the most significant change was in Alexander himself. Working closely with Marcus and learning about the lives of the palace staff had given him a deeper understanding of leadership and responsibility. He began to see that true nobility wasn't about privilege and ceremony, but about using power and resources to improve the lives of others. The prince started making other changes in his daily routine. He began learning the names of staff members he had never bothered to acknowledge before. He made a point of thanking people personally for their work. He asked about their families and remembered details from previous conversations. These small gestures had enormous impact, making employees feel seen and valued in ways they had never experienced before. Alexander also began paying attention to working conditions throughout the palace. He arranged for better lighting in the servants' quarters, improved heating in the work areas, and upgraded equipment in the kitchens and maintenance shops. These improvements were practical demonstrations that the royal family's concern for their staff went beyond words to concrete actions. As the program expanded, Alexander and Marcus began planning for the next phase, creating the advisory roles that would allow retirees to maintain meaningful connections to the palace while pursuing their personal goals. They envisioned former employees serving as consultants, mentors, and advisors, sharing their expertise while working flexible schedules that allowed time for family and personal interests. Marcus was particularly excited about this aspect of the program. "Your Highness," he said during one of their planning sessions, "imagine if we could create a system where people like Mrs. Eleanor could train new housekeepers while also having time to visit her sister in the countryside. Or where Thomas could oversee major maintenance projects while also being able to attend his son's school events." The vision they were creating was revolutionary in its simplicity, treating long-time employees as valuable human beings whose knowledge, experience, and well-being mattered beyond their immediate utility to the royal family. It was an approach that honored the past while building a better future for everyone connected to the palace. As winter turned to spring, Alexander realized that the program was succeeding beyond his original hopes. But he also knew that the most challenging part still lay ahead: convincing his parents and the royal court that these changes were not just generous gestures but essential elements of effective leadership. The time was approaching when Alexander would need to formally present the program to his family and request their official support. Marcus would play a crucial role in that presentation, serving as living proof that investing in people's well-being created better outcomes for everyone. The guard's transformation from a tired, aching man counting down to retirement to an energetic advocate for positive change would be the most powerful argument Alexander could make for expanding the program throughout the entire royal household. The day Alexander had been both anticipating and dreading finally arrived. He had requested a formal audience with his parents, King William and Queen Isabella, to present what he described as an important initiative regarding palace administration. The king's private study was chosen for the meeting, a room lined with portraits of previous monarchs who had ruled the kingdom of Valeria for centuries. Alexander had spent days preparing his presentation, working closely with Marcus to ensure that every detail was perfect. The guard would play a central role in the meeting, serving as both an example of the program's success and a testament to the value of treating staff as respected members of the palace community. When the appointed hour arrived, Alexander entered the study accompanied by Marcus, who walked with a confidence and dignity that impressed even Alexander. The guard had traded his usual uniform for formal court dress, and his bearing reflected both his years of faithful service and his new role as an advisor and advocate. King William looked up from his desk with curiosity and mild surprise. "Alexander, I wasn't expecting you to bring anyone to our meeting. Is Guard Captain Webb here for security reasons?" "Actually, Father," Alexander said, "Marcus is here as my advisor and colleague. What I want to discuss today involves him directly, and his insights are essential to understanding the proposal I'm bringing to you." Queen Isabella raised an eyebrow at the unusual arrangement, but she gestured for both men to be seated. Alexander had learned over the years that his mother was often more perceptive about people and situations than his father, and he was counting on her ability to see the value in what he was proposing. "Your Majesties," Alexander began. Over the past several months, I've been conducting research into the lives and experiences of our longtime employees. What I've discovered has convinced me that we have an opportunity to strengthen our kingdom by better recognizing and supporting the people who serve our family. He began by sharing stories about Marcus, Mrs. Eleanor, Sarah, James, and other staff members, painting a picture of dedicated individuals who had sacrificed their health, time with family, and personal dreams in service to the royal family. He spoke about Marcus's grandchildren who barely knew their grandfather, about Sarah's mother who nearly died because medical treatment was unaffordable, about the countless small ways that loyal employees struggled in silence rather than burden their employers with personal problems. King William listened with growing discomfort, clearly not accustomed to thinking about their staff as individuals with complex personal lives. "Alexander," he interrupted, "while I appreciate your concern for our employees, we do provide fair wages and benefits. It's not our responsibility to solve every personal problem our staff might have." "With respect, Father," Alexander replied, "I believe it is our responsibility, or at least our opportunity. These people haven't just worked for us. They've devoted their lives to us. Marcus has spent 30 years putting our family's safety above his own well-being. Mrs. Eleanor has maintained the dignity and beauty of our home while her own health deteriorated. They've earned more than fair wages. They've earned our genuine care and support." Queen Isabella was studying Marcus's face as Alexander spoke, and Alexander could see that she was beginning to understand the deeper implications of what he was saying. "Marcus," she said directly, "you've been with us since before Alexander was born. In all that time, have you ever felt that your service was properly recognized?" The question clearly surprised Marcus, but he answered with characteristic honesty. "Your Majesty, serving your family has been the greatest honor of my life. But if I may speak freely, there have been times when I wondered if my colleagues and I were seen as people rather than simply functions. We've watched each other struggle with problems that could be easily solved, and we've done so in silence because we didn't want to seem ungrateful or demanding." "What kind of problems?" the Queen asked, genuinely curious. Marcus glanced at Alexander, who nodded encouragingly. "Medical expenses that force people to choose between treatment and supporting their families. Children who have academic potential but can't afford education. Elderly parents who need care while their adult children work long hours here. Retirements that people fear because the benefits aren't sufficient to maintain basic dignity." King William shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "These are the kinds of challenges that ordinary people face everywhere. We can't solve everyone's problems, but we can solve the problems of people who have dedicated their lives to us," Alexander said firmly. "Father, the cost of providing meaningful support to our longtime employees is less than we spend on entertaining guests for state dinners. We're not talking about charity to strangers. We're talking about recognition for people who have earned our respect and gratitude." Alexander then presented the details of the Palace Family Recognition Program, explaining how it would work and what it would cost. He showed how employees like Marcus could transition into advisory roles that would benefit both the palace and the individuals involved. He demonstrated how investing in staff well-being would improve loyalty, performance, and the overall atmosphere of the palace. "Marcus has become my advisor on this project," Alexander explained, "and his insights have been invaluable. He knows this palace and its people better than anyone, and his wisdom has helped shape every aspect of the program. When he eventually retires, we'll lose decades of irreplaceable knowledge unless we find ways to preserve and share it." Queen Isabella was clearly moved by the presentation. "Marcus," she said, "what would this program mean to you personally?" Marcus straightened in his chair, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 30 years of unspoken thoughts and feelings. "Your Majesty, it would mean that I could be a grandfather to my grandchildren while still serving your family in meaningful ways. It would mean that my colleagues could face their futures with dignity instead of fear. Most importantly, it would mean that decades of loyal service would be honored rather than simply acknowledged." The room fell silent as the full impact of Marcus's words settled over everyone present. King William was clearly struggling with concepts that challenged his traditional understanding of the relationship between royalty and their staff. But Queen Isabella was nodding slowly, her expression reflecting growing understanding and approval. "Alexander," the Queen said finally, "this program represents a significant change in how our family operates. Are you prepared to take personal responsibility for its implementation and success? Yes, Mother, Alexander replied without hesitation. This is the most important work I've ever undertaken. I believe it will strengthen our family's legacy and create positive changes that will benefit the kingdom for generations to come. King William looked between his son and Marcus. Seeing something in both men that he had never noticed before, Alexander had the bearing of someone who had found his true purpose, while Marcus radiated the confidence of a man whose value was finally being recognized. Very well, the king said slowly. You have my permission to move forward with this program on a trial basis, but I want regular reports on its progress and costs. And Marcus, he added, turning to the guard, I want your honest assessment of how this affects palace operations and staff morale. Thank you, Your Majesty, Marcus replied. I promise you that this program will demonstrate the wisdom of investing in people, rather than simply employing them. As the meeting concluded, Alexander felt a profound sense of accomplishment and relief. The hardest part of his journey was complete. He had gained official support for the program and, more importantly, he had helped his parents begin to see their staff as real people deserving of respect and care. But Alexander also knew that the real work was just beginning. Now he and Marcus would need to implement the program in ways that truly transformed lives, while maintaining the palace's traditions and effectiveness. The success of their efforts would determine whether this initiative became a lasting legacy or a forgotten experiment. 3 months after the formal presentation to the king and queen, the Palace Family Recognition Program had transformed not just individual lives, but the entire culture of the royal household. The changes were visible everywhere, from the improved lighting in work areas to the smiles on faces that had once shown only professional courtesy. Marcus stood in the same corridor where Alexander had first noticed his struggles, but everything about him had changed. The man who had once appeared worn down by decades of service now carried himself with renewed purpose and vitality. His back was straighter, his step more confident, and most remarkably, he smiled often and genuinely. The program's success had exceeded even Alexander's optimistic expectations. Sarah's mother had made a full recovery and was now helping care for Sarah's young children while Sarah pursued educational opportunities funded by the program. James had not only recovered from his respiratory condition, but had been promoted to head chef, a position that came with better hours and working conditions. Mrs. Eleanor had transitioned to a mentoring role that allowed her to share her decades of expertise while working a schedule that accommodated her health needs. But it was Marcus's transformation that most clearly demonstrated the program's impact. After 30 years of full-time guard duty, he had accepted a new role as chief security advisor, a position that utilized his vast experience while allowing him the flexibility to spend meaningful time with his family. On this particular morning, Marcus was preparing for something he had never imagined possible. He was about to submit his formal resignation from active guard duty, not because he was forced to leave or because he was no longer valued, but because the royal family had created an opportunity for him to serve in a new capacity while reclaiming his role as a grandfather and father. Alexander found Marcus in the garden, where they had held so many of their planning conversations. The guard was holding an envelope, his resignation letter, but his expression showed excitement rather than sadness. Are you ready for this? Alexander asked, settling onto their familiar bench. Marcus smiled, an expression of pure contentment that Alexander had never seen on the guard's face before. Your Highness, I have never been more ready for anything in my life. For the first time in 30 years, I'm not choosing between my duty to your family and my love for my own family. Thanks to you, I can honor both. The previous week, Marcus had spent 4 consecutive days with his grandchildren, the longest period he had ever been able to spend with them. His 5-year-old granddaughter had finally gotten to know her grandfather, and she had proudly told her friends that he worked for real princes and princesses. His daughter Sarah had cried when she saw how much happier and healthier her father looked. I have something for you, Marcus said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, carefully wrapped package. It's not much, but I wanted you to have something to remember what we've accomplished together. Alexander unwrapped the package to find a simple wooden carving of the palace, intricately detailed and obviously crafted with great care. Marcus, did you make this yourself? I did, Marcus replied with pride. I started woodworking again recently, something I haven't had time for in decades. My grandson helped me with some of the details. It's amazing how much joy you can find in simple things when you're not constantly exhausted and worried about the future. Alexander was deeply moved by the gift, but even more by what it represented. Marcus had rediscovered parts of himself that had been buried under years of relentless duty and worry. The program hadn't just provided financial security, it had given him back his identity as a complete person. There's something else I want to tell you, Marcus said, his voice becoming more serious. Yesterday I received a visit from Captain Thompson from the Royal Guard Academy. He's heard about our program and wants to discuss implementing something similar for military families throughout the kingdom. What we've started here is inspiring changes far beyond the palace walls. Alexander felt a surge of pride and satisfaction. The program's influence was spreading, just as he had hoped it would. Other institutions were beginning to understand that investing in people's well-being created stronger, more loyal, more effective organizations. That afternoon, a small ceremony was held in the throne room to formally recognize Marcus's transition from active guard to chief security advisor. The event was attended by the entire royal family and all the palace staff, a gathering that would have been unthinkable before the program began. King William, who had initially been skeptical of the program, spoke with genuine warmth as he thanked Marcus for his years of service and welcomed him to his new role. Marcus Webb represents the finest qualities of service and dedication, the king said. His wisdom and experience will continue to benefit our family for many years to come. Queen Isabella presented Marcus with a formal commendation that would become part of the palace's permanent historical record. But the moment that brought tears to many eyes was when Marcus's daughter and grandchildren were invited to join the ceremony, officially recognizing that the guard's family was part of the palace community. As the ceremony concluded, Marcus approached Alexander with his formal resignation from active guard duty. The letter, written in his careful handwriting, was brief but heartfelt. After 30 years of faithful service as a palace guard, I hereby submit my resignation from active duty to accept the position of Chief Security Advisor. I do so with gratitude for the opportunity to continue serving the royal family while also being present for my own family. This transition represents not an ending but a new beginning. Alexander accepted the resignation with a mixture of sadness and joy. Sadness because it marked the end of an era, but joy because it represented the beginning of something better for everyone involved. Later that evening, as Alexander walked through the palace corridors, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. It had begun with a simple observation about a tired guard's struggle to stand at his post. It had evolved into a comprehensive program that was changing lives and influencing policies beyond the palace walls. The young prince realized that his quiet decision to pay attention to the people around him had created ripples that would continue long after he was gone. Marcus would spend his remaining years as a respected advisor, while also being the grandfather his family deserved. Other longtime employees were finding new dignity and security in their work. Most importantly, the royal family had learned to see their staff as valued, members of an extended family rather than simply as employees. The program's success had taught Alexander valuable lessons about leadership and responsibility. True power, he had learned, wasn't about commanding others but about empowering them. Real nobility came not from inherited titles, but from using privilege to improve other people's lives. As he prepared for bed that night, Alexander found the wooden carving Marcus had given him and placed it on his bedside table. Every time he looked at it, he would remember that small acts of attention and kindness could grow into transformative change. He would remember that behind every uniform and every job title was a real person with dreams, struggles, and the desire to be seen and valued. Marcus's resignation had indeed been prompted by Alexander's low-key but strong move, but it wasn't a resignation born of frustration or disappointment. It was a resignation that represented new possibilities, renewed purpose, and the recognition that a life of service could be honored while still allowing room for personal happiness and family love. The heartfelt story that had begun with a prince noticing a guard's hidden pain had become a testament to the power of compassion, attention, and the courage to challenge traditions in service of human dignity. And in the years that followed, both Alexander and Marcus would continue to build on what they had started, creating a legacy of care and respect that would influence the kingdom for generations to come.